r/NoSleep. Posted by u/LeftyLizard9085. I play a game they call Sleep Points. Every night I hide under my blanket. Part 2. Friends. Part 1 video link in description. It felt like 2 or 3 hours or so, but I did eventually go to sleep that night. In the morning when I woke up, I still saw that damn clock from last night on my bedstand. It wasn't broken. Not a scratch on it. For a moment I was trying for the life of me to reckon with what had just happened and how the clock could possibly still be intact, but then a completely rational answer hit me. I had officially experienced sleep paralysis. And that made sense to me, because I had heard about how sometimes when you sleep on your back, you'll get that. I had just woken up on my back, so whenever I actually did fall asleep, probably well before midnight and I just didn't know it, I must have fallen asleep on my back and had an episode of sleep paralysis. I had never had that happen to me before, but I had always heard from people who did and the utter terror that comes over you when it happens. I figured now, the next time someone went to me with their story of sleep paralysis, I could fire back with my own and it could be a whole topic of conversation and we'd both laugh about how the fictional situations we both thought would kill us obviously weren't even real. When I woke up, I looked for my phone on my bedstand, but it wasn't there. Since I was still shaken up, this scared me way more than it should have. What had that app or that demon done to my phone? I was so scared that it took me a moment to realize that my phone didn't just disappear, and it actually made total sense that it wasn't on my bedstand. I was so traumatized by the events of the night before that I had totally forgotten about how grounded I was, so of course my phone wasn't on my bedstand. What had happened was sleep paralysis and my phone obviously wasn't on my bedstand since I was grounded. I actually felt pretty calm once I realized that everything I experienced had a completely logical explanation. I took a sigh of relief and a few deep breaths, just to get my bearings, and got out of bed. Mom had made breakfast, and I was going to school, and everything was going back to normal. I really didn't want to look too out of the ordinary since I also really didn't want to talk about what had happened with my parents because then they'd get all worried about me. Maybe I'd tell them about it relatively soon, after it was officially all in the past and I didn't still get PTSD from remembering what happened, but I obviously wasn't there just yet. Since I'm so introverted, I imagine I didn't seem any more quiet or closed off than usual since my mom didn't ask me if anything was the matter. Even though I didn't know if anything I saw or heard last night was real, I still was curious about that app with the guy sleeping. I knew I was grounded, but I also knew where to find my phone since it was just on the charger of my parents' room. Dad left for work at 6 o'clock so Mom was the only one in the house I'd have to worry about catching me. While she took her morning shower, something she always did just after setting out breakfast for me, I snuck into her and Dad's room. I tried to keep it quiet, but the door creaked while I was opening it a little louder than what I was going for. Sure enough, there was my phone, right where I thought it was, still on the charger. Apparently, even though it had been on the charger all night, it was still only at 80%. Whatever that app's deal was, it was being a serious drain on my phone's battery. Which just made the fact that the app wouldn't even let me delete it even more infuriating. I opened the app and tried to see if this time I could make it do something. I tried swiping this way and that, I tried tapping here, there, and everywhere, still nothing. But checking the app wasn't a total loss since one crucial detail had changed from yesterday. Instead of a 0 in the middle of the blank white screen, there was a number 10. I figured it must have been keeping score for something. And if what I experienced last night really did happen and if this app really did have something to do with it, maybe these were some kind of points that I earned purely from surviving the night. But at this point, I had no idea. Anyway, I still refused to believe that last night was real or that the app had anything to do with anything. Although, I did still think it was pretty weird how slowly my phone was charging and how fast it was draining battery. But that was probably just because the app I had downloaded was some kind of virus and that was why that was happening. But still, I had an iPhone and I always heard about how immune Apple products were from viruses. But either new inroads were being made in the whole infect iPhones with viruses department, or Apple's advertising is just bullshit. And I had a good feeling it was probably the second of the two. I knew I should have gotten a Samsung. I took the bus to school and slept on the way there since by 7 o'clock in the morning the sun still wasn't even close to rising. I woke up a couple of stops before the bus arrived at school. This was weird for me, but for the first time I was actually pretty happy to be going to school. I needed every distraction from last night I could find so that I didn't fall into a downward spiral of obsessing over it. My day at school was normal and I didn't get another detention. But whether I really did go to bed earlier than I thought last night or not, I was still totally drained even after my nap on the bus. Unlike the day before, no one at school bothered me, or really even said anything to me at all. Which I preferred. I didn't talk to anybody at school anyway and with how tired I was all day long, I was not in any mood to change that. I did come into contact Truman, however, just like the day before. I saw him and his asshole buddies reenacting how I was fighting him for my backpack while laughing their heads off. "Best $10 I ever spent," one of the asshole friends said to Truman. "So worth the detention?" Truman said back. So that explained it. Someone had given him money to do what he did to me. I wasn't entirely sure if that made it better or worse, but at least some dickhead lost money in the process. Although even then, the $10 only went to some other dickhead, so I guess that sorta cancels things out. Even when I went home on the bus, I was still tired and took another nap. After that I seemed to feel less tired, though. I got straight to work on my homework since I had literally nothing else to do, but after I was done, I just lied there on my bed daydreaming and thinking about the last midnight until Mom and Dad called me down to dinner. Homework had taken a while, so thankfully by the time I was done I didn't have to spend that long lying around and ruminating about the previous night's events. Soon enough, Mom and Dad came around to call me over to the kitchen. I guess Mom and Dad felt they had already made their point last night, so tonight they weren't still on my case. Or at least they weren't still on my case about the whole detention thing. As always with parents, if they aren't nagging you about one thing, it's something else. Just because you're grounded doesn't mean you have to stay cooped up in your room all the time, you know, my mom pointed out. What am I gonna do, play outside? Our home state is a literal tundra, I think I quite reasonably responded. The snow isn't that bad today. Besides, you could use some exercise. All that laying around's no good for you, my dad chimed in. It's still freezing, I said, just trying to get out of the "you need to play outside more" lecture my parents were always giving me. Which annoys the hell out of me because for one thing, it's the 21st century. Kids can generally entertain themselves without leaving the house, so no one really plays outside anymore. Even if I was gonna go play outside, who was I gonna do that with? Even if people did still play outside, I didn't even know of any kids in the neighborhood my age to begin with. Well, I've certainly bought you plenty of winter coats over the years, my mom said in the same passive-aggressive tone of voice she always uses when I forget to acknowledge stuff she buys for me. Who knows? Maybe soon enough she'd be fishing for a "thank you for that glow-in-the-dark clock that scared me way more than it should have the previous night." I was guessing that couldn't have been cheap. But still, whoever's making these glow-in-the-dark clocks should seriously consider investing in a less ominous-looking color, I thought to myself. But just like the day before, the clock never seemed to come up in conversation. "But there's hardly any daylight out by now," I reminded her, back on the subject of me going outside. For a moment she didn't respond, so I thought I may have finally hit on a point that proved my case. But then, next thing I know, she gets up, goes to her bedroom, and hands me a flashlight from her bedroom drawer. Great. So I guess I'm doing this, I thought to myself. So I put a sweater on, put on my winter coat and an extra pair of socks, took the flashlight and went on my freezing, dark, and miserable walk. Because apparently this is just so much less depressing than staying in my room, where there's at least this little thing called central heating, I said to no one in particular, after I was far enough away from the house to be within earshot of anybody. I spent my walk doing the same thing I could have done from the warmth of room, just more questioning myself about if last night was real and, if so, what I should do if the same thing happened again tonight. Or even could do about it. I had decided that the clock being glow in the dark and changing color from white to red wasn't so extraordinary. Maybe it just came with settings that made it do that on its own as it approached midnight. That much was probably true. So that part of last night may very well have not been a hallucination. Just that the maroon color freaked me out to the point where I had started seeing things. Other things. It was probably just what I had told myself last night already, but still hadn't completely processed or truly accepted, that the clock was reflecting my own face, and in my fear of the dark and the glowing red color, I had hallucinated a different one. But that still didn't explain why the eyes, nose, mouth, and everything else continuously grew to the point of breaking the clock. And how the clock miraculously got fixed by morning without a scratch on it, good as new. Or the sound of the thing slithering and hissing and whatever other ungodly noises that piece of shit from inside was making. That must have been the sleep paralysis. To justify all of this, I started going back in my mind over an old episode of SpongeBob that I used to watch as a kid. It was the one where SpongeBob has to write an 800-word essay on all the things not to do at a stoplight. And then he spends all night trying to put off writing it, and that's why the episode is called Procrastination. I think most of you would probably know the episode I'm talking about here. It's one of those SpongeBob episodes from that full-on classic era that we all know and love. Well anyway, that episode seemed relevant to me because, at its climax, it's midnight and this snail clock that SpongeBob has starts glowing. And then, Just like what happened with me, a face breaks out of from behind the glass of his clock and starts telling him in an ominous voice that his time is up. But then he wakes up and realizes it's all a dream. So basically, my reasoning at this point was that this episode in particular must have made some kind of impression in my subconscious, and that was why my nightmare or sleep paralysis or whatever had wound up taking the specific form that it did. And that made sense because, after all, that part of the episode where SpongeBob has all those hallucinations did use to legitimately scare me as a kid. But anyway, so going back to my walk, I know I said I didn't know of any kids my age in the neighborhood and, while that was true before my walk, by the end it wasn't anymore. I managed to find someone whom I had seen before, just the day before this. In fact, it wasn't Truman, but when I recognized the kid as Ezra, I almost wished it had just been him instead. At least Truman only gives you crap to get something out of it. Like the $10 he got from his idiot friends. Ezra never seemed to benefit from bullying others. He always seemed to get under your skin just to do it. I saw him shoveling snow out on his front yard. Dad had said the snow wasn't that bad, and all in all, he was kinda right. There was only maybe 2 or 3 inches. Not much by Alaskan standards, so I wasn't really sure what the shoveling was about. He also wasn't wearing any gloves and only had a t-shirt and shorts on. I had no idea how he wasn't freezing to death. I've talked about how Ezra is a jerk, but never about the fact that, beyond anything else, the kid's just a fucking weirdo. He just seemed to try and get reactions out of people in general. It didn't even have to be anger. Utter confusion seemed to suffice just as well. I tried not to make any eye contact. I thought about how, while he was tall, he still was pretty skinny. And for all the fights he would always get into, it's not like he would ever actually win. Maybe he really was a better alternative than Truman. Maybe I at least had a fighting chance. And then he looked at me. He even seemed to recognize me. But he just chuckled to himself with this anime villain style laugh he's always doing to look edgy, and got back to his shoveling. Like I said. Fucking weirdo. Ultimately he just seemed to ignore me like everyone else at school did. And I won't lie, it kinda hurt to get blown off and dismissed by probably the least popular kid in school. I hate dealing with people's bullshit, but I at least like to think that I'm worth their time of day. So the fact that I wasn't, not even to a guy like him, did kinda sting a little. But even then, I could still probably rationalize it because, after all, Ezra was never the type to care about anything or anyone, so this probably wasn't all that out of place for him. Although, I did feel as though I was beginning to understand why he was always acting out how he was. Even negative attention is better than being treated like you're invisible. At least if you have negative attention, people know who you are and talk about you. And, not counting today at school with Truman and his friends mocking how I was trying to get my backpack from him, and yesterday when the incident itself took place, I pretty much never got any attention from anyone, positive or negative. Even Truman's teasing was never all that common. Ezra might have been something of a bully, but at the end of the day, he was an outcast loner just as much as I was. Since that was something I could relate to, it made what he did at least a little bit more forgivable. At least to me, just because I could relate. I made my way back home and hopped into bed under my nice and warm blankets, away from the blistering cold of the outside world. It was about 8 o'clock, and the clock had started turning red just as it had the night before at that exact same time. But that didn't really bother me. It was just like what I was telling myself on my walk. The clock was probably just programmed to do that once it reached a certain time of night. Maybe it was supposed to double as a nightlight. In any case, I didn't think much of it, and since I was tired from my walk and bored from being grounded, just like the day before, I decided to go to sleep. I woke up from the bright light of the clock. I was sleeping with my head at the foot of the bed, directly facing the clock, what with how I had lulled myself to sleep from watching the time tick by. I could tell it was still night since it was still pitch dark in my room apart from the clock. I checked it to see what time it was, but before the numbers could enter my brain, I had a mini heart attack. There was that damn face again in the clock. Looking exactly as it did the night before. I know I talked about how, if you look in a mirror long enough, you start hallucinating faces. But I had literally just looked at the clock and immediately saw exactly the same face all over again, plain as day. You know what? I thought to myself. Maybe, I'm just having recurring nightmares. None of this can be real. This so fucking crazy. This just can't be happening. I started feeling detached from reality. Like my whole existence was a lie, now that I could no longer seem to tell my dreams apart from reality. This couldn't be the real world, no matter how real it all felt. There was just no rational explanation for anything. But that's just what makes the unexplainable so scary. It doesn't care that you can't explain why it's there. It just is. And no amount of reasoning is going to argue with that. This was my situation. It didn't matter that it made no goddamn sense whatsoever. This was just what was happening. The clock read 11:51. If I had slept just 9 minutes more, my head would have been exposed by the time the monster broke out of its clock prison. And God only knows what would have happened then. As much as I didn't care for the deep red light emanating from the clock, it literally saved my life with its oppressive brightness. In the few minutes that I had left before midnight, I questioned if maybe I should just leave the room. That seemed like the obvious answer. But whatever was in the clock could probably just ultra instinct shaggy its way out of my room, even if I locked the door behind me. And even in the best case scenario, I'd still just be locking myself out of my own room. But then again, it could probably also uncover blankets, but it didn't do that the previous night. But I guess because hiding under my blankets was ultimately the thing that worked the previous night, I somehow felt protection from it. That's probably one of the most childish things I've ever said, but it was exactly the way I was feeling at the time. I felt like a toddler whose blankie was saving him from the scary monsters of the night. Mainly because it was all totally true. By 11:58, I figured that whatever worked last night would probably work tonight and that I should do everything exactly how I had done it the night before, body completely covered by the blanket and no sudden movements. Hell, no movement at all. I didn't want to risk trying something new since I already knew what I did before it worked. I heard it. I heard it all over again. The glass breaking, the sound of an unholy being slithering around my room, hissing, shouting, and other inexplicable noises. I had another one of those mini heart attacks. Deep down, I think I still believed my own bullshit, that the clock wasn't really a threat and that it was all in my head. After that, I had to finally confront the fact that the clock stuff was real. All of it. I spent basically the whole rest of the night trying to do just that. I never did wake up the next morning as I had stayed up the rest of the night. Now there was no possible way for any of it to have been a dream.